We've got a new recorder on the camera tonight, so
Yeah, well, don't expect much.
I'm sure it'll go great. Let's have prayer. Father, we come into your presence tonight, thankful and mindful of the blessings you've given to us even this very day. We ask that you be with us during this time of the study of your word. Open our spirits and our minds and hearts to the truths that will glean tonight. May it cause us to become more intimately aware of these last days and what is before us. And encourage us during these times to represent you and represent you well in the lives we live throughout the week and by our testimony. We pray that you would be honored and glorified tonight in all that we say and do, because we do ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Last week, we gave you just this quick overview of what we're going to be doing over these next few weeks. Last week, we did a review. We had, as most of you know, a 12-week study in the fall of last year, and we picked up from there, going back and filling in some of the blanks that we didn't have time to deal with more directly during that study. So tonight we're going to be talking about the millennial kingdom of Jesus Christ here on the earth and what's involved in that and what all that means. Next week we're going to deal with the great white throne judgment and eternity, the lake of fire, and what we commonly refer to as hell, and deal pretty in depth with that. Following that, we're going to deal with the new universe, the new earth, the new heavens, the new Jerusalem, or what we would refer to as heaven. And then the last couple of weeks, as your interest is in those, we will do question and answers. And I don't know if I told you this, I think I told someone this, but several years ago, whenever I was speaking, preaching in a church there in Central Florida, I also taught a Sunday school class every morning. I taught a Wednesday night class, and I preached Sunday morning and Sunday nights. And so, in the Sunday morning class, we'd come to the end of a study. We had about a 3-week window gap there before we'd start a new series. So it was mostly all young couples, and I just said, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to just do a question and answer, open mic. And come in, you can ask me anything you want about any part of the Bible. If I can answer it, I'll answer it. And we're going to do this for the next 2 or 3 weeks. So we did, and at the end of that, they said, well, can we just keep doing this, asking questions? So I said, well, that's fine with me if that's what y'all want to do. And so that's what we did for the next 8.5 months. So we encourage you, when we have the chance to ask questions, to ask those questions. Jot them down, something to remind you of the question you want to ask so that you don't lose it. But we will kind of go back through the whole venue we studied and address questions, answer questions, and things that you may have. So tonight we're going to begin looking at the millennial kingdom of Christ. I realize that print's pretty small, and I've been doing this slide on my phone, which has very limited space. I found out I could do it on my Chromebook, and it would save it to my phone. So I was just typing away like crazy and all that, and saved the slide, and when I got my phone out and put it up on the screen, I thought, that's about 3 times smaller than it probably needs to be. So I'll cover all of this, and if you need to, I noticed last time some of you would come up and take a picture of that with your phone, so feel free to do that before we leave if you think you want to do that. We're going to begin in Revelation chapter 20, and we're going to read the first 6 verses, which is dealing with the millennial reign of Christ. Revelation chapter 20, beginning in verse 1. John said, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. A number of years ago, I was sitting on an ordination council for a young preacher, and we were asking him questions. I don't know if you're familiar with ordinations for pastors, but we were asking questions. And one of the pastors asked him the question. He said, do you believe that Satan is bound with a chain? And the young man said, if he is, it's an awfully long chain, because he seems to be everywhere I go. Well, there will come the day whenever there will be a binding of Satan. It will be for the duration of the 1,000 years that comprise the millennial reign of Christ. Continuing reading in verse 4, John says, then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, or had received the mark on their foreheads or on their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the ones who share in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God in Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. In those handful of verses, the reference to 1,000 years has popped up at least 6 times. And this is in reference to this 1,000-year reign, the millennial reign of Christ on the earth. So we're going to talk about these questions. First question is, what is the millennial reign kingdom? This is the title that is given to this 1,000 years. The word millennium means what? 1,000. It's kind of an obvious where this is coming from. So because this reign of Christ on the earth will last for 1,000 years, it's called the millennium reign of Christ. That's what it is. When does this millennial reign of Christ begin? It begins immediately after the Battle of Armageddon, which ends the Great Tribulation period. Now, I know that most of you, if you still have the chart we gave you, by the way, all of them were taken last week, so I'm going to have some more printed up. So if you didn't get one of these charts, we'll have some more for you next week. But if you look at that chart, you'll see as it spans the 7 years of the tribulation period, that it comes up to the very end, and on the very far right-hand part of the page, the very last thing says, millennial reign begins. So the earth will have gone through the 7 years of the tribulation period. Most dramatically, the last 3.5 of those years, called the Great Tribulation, which is where most of the very destructive judgment of God, as well as the judgment of the Antichrist, takes place. Jesus Christ comes back to the earth to bring an end to the reign of the Antichrist and the reign of Satan. The Antichrist and the false prophet are immediately cast into the lake of fire, the bottomless pit. And by the way, I'll be done with this more next week, but Lewis and I were playing golf one day some months ago, and he was asking me about some of these things, and he wanted to know about the bottomless pit. And I told him that, according to what I understand from talking with doctors and other people, that as human beings, we are born with only 2 inborn fears. Every other fear we have is acquired or learned. But the two inborn fears that we're born with, one is the fear of falling. The other is the fear of a loud and sudden noise. The vast majority of people, whether it be a child or an adult, if some loud noise happens behind them unexpectedly, what is their usual reaction? Kind of a jumping motion, whatever, or in some cases a running motion. The other inborn fear is the fear of falling. And I used to really kind of razz on all the young couples in my church that had babies. I said, whenever you take the little junior and you throw him up in the air and you catch him and he's got this kind of funny look on his face, he's not a happy camper. That's not a smile. That's fear radiating from the inside up to his face, because that fear of falling is an inborn fear. Contemplate a bottomless pit to where, for eternity, you're in the sensation of falling, anticipating at any moment hitting the bottom. As they say, it's not the falling that bothers you, it's that sudden stop. But if there's no sudden stop, if it's just that continuous feeling of falling, that's a pretty exasperating environment in which to live, especially for eternity. Preview's over with. That's the commercial for next week. We'll talk about that. Coming back to the millennium as to when it begins, when Jesus Christ returns to the earth, he will come back riding on white horses with all of the armies of heaven, which will include you and I, riding with him and coming down. He will immediately engage Antichrist and Satan in battle, defeating them and casting Antichrist and false prophet into the lake of fire, into that bottomless pit, and binding Satan for the 1,000 years. So the millennial reign is going to begin immediately after the ending of the tribulation period, when all the cleanup is finished. Actually, it'll start before the cleanup is finished, but that's when Christ is going to set up his rule in Jerusalem on the throne of David. And it will be a rule, as he describes it, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, with a rod of iron. Meaning, it will be a forced rule. People will not have any choice in Jesus' ruling. He's going to come back. He's going to sit up on the throne. He's going to rule it. Like it or leave it, it doesn't matter. He's going to be on the throne, and he's going to be in charge. So, immediately after the Battle of Armageddon, that ends the tribulation period, is when this 1,000-year span of time is going to kick in. So what's the purpose of this? Why does this even happen? Why is there even going to be a ruling of Christ for 1,000 years on the earth? Well, it is to fulfill biblical prophecies that pertain to the covenants that God made with Israel. And I want to pause here and make a really kind of an important point. When you're studying end-time events, you have to be very, very careful in your interpretation of those events as to who is involved in that event. Here's what I mean. We come into the tribulation period with the predominant representation of God on the earth being the church, right?
Amen.
Part of the way through in the transition, the focus shifts away from the church, because once the rapture takes place, church is not even here.
Right.
The focus now has returned to Israel. And if you aren't careful and you're trying to engage in end-time interpretation, you can take scriptures that apply to Israel and apply them to the church, which doesn't fit, or vice versa. You can take scripture that applies to the church, but it doesn't apply to Israel. Let me give you a classic illustration. Don't worry about it, this is not in the notes. I'm just making this up as I go along. Or not making it up, but I'm just telling you this as we're going along here. One of the times when Jesus was asked about the end of time and the end of the world and all this thing, he gave a warning. And he talked about the abomination of desolation. Now, we've already covered that. Do any of you remember what the abomination of desolation is? It's what? It's when the Antichrist goes into the temple that has been rebuilt in Jerusalem and kicks everybody out and demands to be worshipped as God. That's the abomination of desolation. Jesus said to his followers, this is where it gets confusing, because who were his disciples? Were they Jews or were they church members? Both. Right? They were his disciples of the church. Later they become the apostles of the church. But they were also Jews. So that's where it gets kind of tricky whenever he's talking to the disciples. Is he talking to them in the context of them being the church, or is he talking to them in the context of being Jews? So in answering their question, he gave this. He said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the place where it ought not to, when you come down from the house, what are you supposed to do? Run. Get out of town. Pray that your flight is not on the Sabbath. So who's he talking to? He's talking to them as Jews. Because at the abomination of desolation, when the Antichrist is going into the temple, whenever he said, worship me, I am God, and he's been rejected, both by believers, by Christians and the Jews, at that point in time, the focus has shifted to the Jewish nation, not to the church. And if we try to make those verses apply to the church, we're going to come up with some kind of weird interpretations of what that's talking about. So you have to be very careful whenever you're going through this to ask the question, who is he talking to? Who's he talking about? Whenever he makes these statements. So, the reason we have this 1,000-year reign of Christ going to happen on the earth is because over the years, thousands of years, God made some very strong promises and covenants with the nation of Israel. They have not yet been completed, but they will be completed during the millennium. We will be there, and I'm going to cover that in more detail in a moment. We as believers, we as Christians are going to be there, but we're going to be in our glorified bodies, and we're going to be reigning on the thrones, and we'll talk about that again in just a minute. But the focus in the millennium is on Israel. So, to begin with, there is the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. I'm going to read a few of these verses because we need to connect these dots. In Genesis 12, beginning in verse 1, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We call that the Abrahamic covenant. When God went to Abram down in the Ur of the Chaldees and said, get out of town, I'm going to take you, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to give you large numbers of offspring, and you're going to become a great nation, and through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. What does that mean? How were all the families of the earth blessed because of Abraham? He became the progenitor. He became the father of the nation of Israel. And through the nation of Israel, who came into the world? Jesus Christ. Have all the families of the earth been blessed because of Jesus Christ? Or have the potential to be blessed because of him? Yes. So this is the Abrahamic covenant. Jesus Christ has come, sacrificing himself on the cross to procure salvation for the human race. Abraham did father many children, protracted out many generations. But this covenant has not been brought to total fruition yet. It's going to be in the millennium, but all of this hasn't been completely completed yet. Which brings us to what is called by some the Palestinian covenant. I don't particularly like that word because there's a negative connotation with what's going on in the Middle East now between the Palestinian people and the Jewish people, the people of Israel. The word Palestinian in terms of the Palestinian covenant means only to the land of Palestine. So in and I'm not going to read the passage in Deuteronomy 30. You can read that because it deals with there. The prophecy is that the Jews will be brought back into the land, and the land that was part of that Palestinian covenant or treaty that God made with Israel will be returned to them. I want to go to Genesis 15 and tell you what that land looks like. This is the land that God promised to give to the nation of Israel. Genesis 15, beginning in verse 18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land. And here are the boundaries. From the river of Egypt. The river of Egypt would be what?
No.
The Nile River. From the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, if you don't have a map in the back of your Bible to do this, when you go home, maybe get one down or whatever. But if you look at the River Nile in Egypt and track that all the way across the Middle East to the Euphrates River, which runs through Iraq you're going to find that the piece of property that God gave to the nation of Israel included half of Egypt, all of Lebanon, all of Syria, all of Jordan, all of Iran, half of Iraq, all of Saudi Arabia, all of Bahrain, all of, I'm missing a couple in there. Anyway, here's my point. Does Israel control all that land right now? Who does? Virtually every one of those countries, I think with no exceptions, is controlled by Muslims, by the Muslim religion. So, that is the Palestinian covenant, or we call it the land covenant. So that has not been fulfilled. Do we agree? It will be fulfilled, guess when? In the millennium. When Jesus Christ is on the throne and he's in charge of everything. The third covenant is called the Davidic covenant, or the covenant of David. It's found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And in essence what that says is that Israel will be ruled by a king from the lineage of David. Now, after David departed the throne with Solomon and a couple of others shortly after him, and then, of course, it wasn't long after that before Israel disbanded. So has that been completed yet, the Davidic covenant? No. Why is there a millennium? What is the purpose of the millennial reign of Christ? It is for God to complete the promises he made to the nation of Israel in the form of these three covenants. And when we get into that millennial reign, Israel will control all of that country, all of those land masses. Jesus will be on the throne, who is a descendant of David. He will be ruling over Israel. So virtually every one of these covenants and promises are going to come to pass and be completed during the millennial reign of Christ on the earth. What did they say this morning in this morning's lesson? God is faithful to do what? Keep his word. Keep his promises. So, although some of these have had a partial fulfillment down through time, as of right now, none of that has been fulfilled in its totality. So that's why there's going to be a 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. We are going to simply be spectators during the millennium, with one exception. We will have some measured responsibility, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Next question I want to answer is, who will be on the earth during the millennial kingdom? Who will be here? All of the believers in their glorified bodies. When do we receive our glorified body as a believer? In the rapture. What did Paul say? We shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In the moment, in the twinkling of an eye. We will go from inhabiting these flesh bodies. I usually use this in funerals. I talk about our bodies, and I refer to them as our earth suits. Earth suit. And the illustration is this: when we shoot astronauts out into space on the space station or wherever we shoot them to. If they're going to get outside that containment, what's the first thing they got to do? They got to put on that spacesuit, right? You don't open that door without that spacesuit being on. You don't crawl out of that capsule or out of that space station into space unless that spacesuit is on. Why? That spacesuit is absolutely necessary to survive that atmosphere, right? Look around this room at everybody in this room. Just take a moment and glance around the room. Do you know what you see? Everybody in their earth suit. You're wearing what you have to have to survive in this environment. When we step into eternity, we're going to be given a glorified body. That is what we have to wear in that environment. That is a body that is uncontaminated by sin, not limited by time nor space, perfect in every way. How many of you have ever traveled outside our country? Where are some places you've been to? Jerusalem. Hawaii. Turkey. Okay. Whatever country you just named that you've been to, can you close your eyes and kind of focus, and can you visualize something about that country that you saw or that you experienced while you were there?
Did not drink the water.
Don't drink the water. I remember, and I'll tell this as quick as I can, I remember that I was asked to go to Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, to do a missionary training conference for about 35 or 40 missionaries working in that country. And there was a big group going with World Hope, and they asked me to go and do this conference. I agreed. They had people already leading the group, so I had no responsibilities except to show up and teach and that kind of thing. On the way back, we got caught in London. Our flight got delayed. The young kid they had in the group had no idea what he was doing. And so we were sitting in Heathrow Airport, and somebody came along and said, you know, we'd been told the whole flight was going to be on a 2 or 3 hour delay. So we're sitting there waiting. Somebody walks through where we were and says, "Hey, flight, whatever the number was, I think it's already here. They're going to board here in a few minutes." Well, I jumped up and grabbed my carry-on bag and headed down this walkway there to go find out where the flight was, because I had no idea where this young guy was that's supposed to be in charge of the group. And I went down there and I walked past the security desk and found out that whatever airport personnel had made that announcement was talking about the wrong airlines. It was the flight number, but it was another airlines altogether. It wasn't British Air. So I turned to go back to where the group was, and I got back to that security desk. They said, "You can't come through here." I said, "What do you mean? I just came through here." I said, "Yeah, but you can't come back through here." And they said, "You got to go downstairs, out of the airport, come back around, come back through TSA security. You got to have all your carry-on bags checked again, take your computers out, and go back as if you'd never been here before. Go back and do all of that, you know, and get back up." I did all of that. When I got back up, they actually had the right number. The plane was there, and everybody was already on the plane. I probably shouldn't tell you all this. Y'all going to get nervous now. Why am I even telling you this story? Because that was such an impactful thing, because all I can envision is those 48 other people, they're sitting in their seats on the plane. That plane's going to back out and take off. I'm going to be stuck here in London for who knows how long before I can get out of here. And because that was such a kind of a vivid incident, in my mind, I can replay every phase of that walking through that Heathrow Airport. I don't want to, but you know, but I can. Now, here's the ultimate question: how quickly, in my mind, could I be in that London airport? Right? Some of the places we're going to go to in Israel, I've been there multiple times. I can visualize the hotel. I can visualize the Sea of Galilee. And instantly I can be there in my mind. When Jesus rose from the dead, where were the disciples hiding? Upper room. He got to the upper room, and what did he do? He just materialized, walked through the wall, right? He was not bound by time nor space. Neither shall we be bound by time nor space in our glorified bodies. And so, when we're sitting here for this thousand of years in our glorified bodies, we can be anywhere, go anywhere, do anything we want to do. Have you ever wondered why our galaxies, why our universe is so big? You know how big it is? Well, nobody really does, but in terms of a fact, we know, you know, it wasn't that long ago to where the Earth was thought to be the center of the universe. The sun revolved around us. We found out that didn't work. That wasn't the way it was. There was the sun, and we revolved around it. Then we found out there was more planets revolving around our sun, and then we found out we were in a galaxy called the Milky Way. And then we discovered that the galaxy itself was revolving. And there were other galaxies out there that were also revolving around. And this thing just kept exploding. We don't have any idea how big. I mean, we're measuring distances now and how long it takes light traveling at 186,000 miles a second, how many thousands of years it will take it to get here. I don't know if you can comprehend that size. Why did God make this so big? Because I think God just wants us to know how big He is. Amen. And I think part of what we're going to be doing, both in the millennium and in eternity particularly, is God is going to be allowing us to explore all of His creation. Want to go to Jupiter? No big deal. Want to see how small Pluto really is? You want to go to some galaxy, that's 180 million light years away? That's fine. God is going to reveal His magnitude to us. And only in these glorified bodies, this is next week's lesson. Only in these glorified bodies are we going to be able to survive in that environment. So who is going to be in the millennial? We are in our glorified bodies. All the believers who were raptured, all the believers who were resurrected the same time as the rapture, and all the believers who went through the tribulation period and lost their lives, all those martyrs, they're going to be resurrected. So all of the believers are going to be here during the millennial in our glorified bodies. Who else is going to be here? All of the unbelievers that survived the tribulation period in their earthly bodies. How do I know that? Jumping ahead to the very last question about how does the millennial kingdom end in rebellion. If there were not unbelievers here on the earth, who would Satan recruit to become a part of that massive army that's going to try to assault Jesus Christ on the throne in Jerusalem? So all of the unbelievers, when Jesus came out of his grave, he was the first fruits of the resurrection. There was also others that came out of their grave too, after his resurrection, back then. They went into Jerusalem and they appeared to other people, I think it was for 40 days. Can you imagine being somebody living in Jerusalem at that point, and you're walking down the streets of Jerusalem, and you bump into Elijah, or Moses, or Daniel, or Zechariah, or Jeremiah, or because they all came out of the grave, and when Jesus went into heaven, they went with him. That's why before Jesus sacrificed himself, it talks about that as believers, we would go to paradise. Paradise and heaven are not the same thing. And so now we talk about when we die, we go to heaven. And we're going to get around maybe next week to trying to explain that a little bit better. But the unbelievers who are here on the earth, they will be here during the millennium. Who will not be here on the earth during the millennium?
The Antichrist.
Satan. The Antichrist and the false prophets, they've already met their future in the lake of fire. But Satan's going to be bound for that 1,000 years. He's not going to have access to us for that 1,000 years. So he won't be around. Which brings us to this kind of last thought. What will be the conditions on the earth during this 1,000-year Antichrist? Jerusalem will become the political capital of the whole world. Jerusalem will be the political capital of the whole world with Jesus sitting on the throne. Revelation chapter 19. Verses 15 and 16. Says it, talking about Jesus coming back on the white horse. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's coming back. This is the second coming of Christ. The rapture is not the second coming, because he doesn't come to the earth in the rapture. This is the second coming to the earth. And when he comes, defeats Antichrist, defeats false prophet, defeats Satan, he will set up his throne. He will rule with a rod of iron. He will be known as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And Jerusalem will be the political capital of the whole world. Why? Because his reign will cover the whole world. Not only will Jerusalem be the political capital, but I want you to, if you don't find, it's the book of Amos in the Old Testament. While you're turning there, I just encourage you to memorize the books of the Bible in order. Some of you have these Bibles that are indexed, and that's fine. I have nothing against them, other than the fact that I don't particularly like them, because if you ever get dependent upon being able to put your thumb there and find the book of the Bible, and then you have to use one you don't have it, you're as lost as a goose trying to find it. Every year in first year chapel, whenever we would speak in chapel to our student body in the Bible college, one of us would get up and say, today we're going to be talking to you from Hezekiah chapter 3, verse 1. And you could listen to page turning in the Bible for 30 minutes looking for Hezekiah. It sounds like a book of the Bible, doesn't it, Hezekiah? When I was first starting out in the chapels, and they would call out some of these Old Testament books of the Bible, I would turn a few pages and I just pretend I found it. That worked out real well until they said, Mr. Morton, would you please read this passage? So that didn't last too long. Have I given you enough time to find Amos? If not, you have something in the front of your Bible called a table of contents that will give you a page number to go to.
As young people, we learned the books of the Bible in Bible school when we were kids.
Mm-hmm. All right, this is the next thing I want to talk about, the conditions during the millennium. The curse on the land, the curse on the ground is going to be removed. You remember when God came to Adam and Eve in the garden? And he first went to Eve. First he went to Adam, because that was even the logical choice. And who did Adam blame for them sinning?
That woman.
Who?
That woman he gave. Come on. That's what he said.
He blamed God. He said, the woman you gave me. This is your fault. Then he blamed Eve. So he went to Eve, and part of the curse on Eve was in childbearing, that it would be a painful experience, and that she would have a desire to rule over her husband. Adam and Eve had worked in total synchronization up until the time sin came. They were together constantly. They made all the decisions corporately together, whatever they were. But then after sin came, God said, Eve, your desire shall be to your husband. Meaning, your desire shall be to rule over your husband. And the result of that was immediate conflict. Because why? What is the most important thing for women? What is the thing that means the most to them? It's relationships. Some years ago, one of the major magazines did a study, psychological study of men and women. And they asked this very simple question. what is the most important thing in your life? 90+% of the women's answer was my family. My husband, my children, my grandchildren. Because women have that emotional bond in relationships. Much to the chagrin and consternation of the women, when the men asked what is the most important thing in your life, their answer was, my job. Men find their self-worth, men find their self-esteem from what they do. Women find their self-esteem and their self-worth in who they are and who is in their body of relationships. So guess where the curses came? For Eve, it was all about relationships. For Adam, God cursed the ground. He'd have to work it in the sweat of his brow. Because that was what was most important to him, was his job. So, now we come to the millennium. In Amos chapter 9, I'm going to begin reading in verse 11. Let me make sure I find this. I was right. Verse 11. In that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, and repair its breaches, and raise it up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom. And all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. Verse 13. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows the seed. Now, let me tell you what that means. This is a prophecy of the millennium, when the curse is removed from the earth. The plowman is the guy doing what? Pushing the plow, right? In other words, he's planting the seed. What is the reaper doing? The reaper is gathering the harvest in, right? Now, if those words had been reversed, and it said that the reaper shall overtake the plowman, we could have inferred from that because the curse on the earth has been removed, will have been removed, that the earth is going to return to its state to where it's so fertile that as soon as the seed's planted, it's going to germinate and produce fruit, and the reaper's going to come right along behind the plowman and harvest things. That's not what it says. It says the plowman will overtake the reaper. This is going to become so fertile that when the seed is planted and the crop comes up, the reaper is busy reaping it, and the plowman is making the second turn because he's already turned, he's replanting the field. He's caught up to the reaper who's reaping this harvest because he's bringing up the next harvest right behind him. My kind of garden. Right? It also says that the treader of grapes, him who sows the seed. Here's this person sowing the seed for the grapevine, and the treaders are already in the vat stomping on the grapes. So the idea here is that the curse on the earth will have been withdrawn during this particular period of time. Verse 14, I will restore the fortunes of my people, Israel. They shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them on their land, and they shall never again be uprooted out of the land that I have given them, says the Lord your God. when Israel steps into that millennial reign of Christ, occupying that whole territory of land that God is going to be given to them. They'll never be uprooted from that again. It's going to be a glorious day. And the thing about it is, as believers in our glorified bodies, we get to stand around and watch all that.
Are we flying around?
I guess you can if you want to. Haven't been there yet, I'm not sure. Not only that, and I'm not going to take the time because we're going to be out of time here in just another few minutes, but in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 through 9, the curse on the animal world is removed. That's the passage that says the lion and the lamb shall lie down together and so on, and the child shall play with the cobra and those kind of things and not be hurt. So the curse on the animal world. We will go back to being able to talk with and communicate with the animal world. Because it's very clear that Adam and Eve communicated with the animals in the Garden of Eden, is it not? I can assure you, I can guarantee you that when that snake slithered up to Eve and spoke to her, if that was not something they had been used to, she would have been out of there. Right? God brought all the animals to Adam and Eve, and they named them, and they called them what they wanted, whatever name they gave them, that's what God called them. And there was clear evidence that there was communication between Adam and Eve and the animals in the Garden of Eden. And this will probably be a time when that will return, when we will be able to have that communication level. That may be some conversations you may not want to have, depending upon how you rate the animals, but there will be an entirely different relationship between us and the animal world, because the curse upon them will have been withdrawn. In other words, there's going to be peace and unity and learning and righteousness and abundance, all those things. It's going to be a perfect environment for that 1,000 years. One last thing, Revelation chapter 20 and verse 4. We read it earlier, but I want to come back to it again. Revelation chapter 20 and verse 4. John says, "Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed." Guess who's sitting on those thrones? Believers. Paul said to the Corinthian church, "Do you not know that you shall sit in judgment of the angels?" Jesus told the parable of the man who had servants and he dispensed out to them so much money, and they came back in and gave their report, and one had taken 1 talent, made 10 talents, and so on. And Jesus' response to the person was, "You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over 10 cities. To the man who had gained 5, he said, "I'll make you ruler over 5 cities." So we will, for the 1,000 years, we will, whatever judgment, whatever decision making, whatever is required, we will assist Jesus in his kingdom reign in doing that. We will be, in effect, territorial rulers with Jesus during the 1,000-year reign upon the earth. And then lastly, when does the 1,000-year reign end? The end of the 1,000 years. That will be basically end in rebellion. Satan will be loosed. He will go out and gather up people that are going to be a part of that rebellion. By the way, let me, I didn't put this in there, but let me throw this in if you're taking notes. One of the things that will exist during the millennial is the return to long life. long life during the millennium. It may be the passage in either Amos or Isaiah, one of those, probably the Isaiah passage, but it talks about that the child shall be 100 years old. Average lifespan today is, I don't know what the average is, but theoretically in the Bible it says 70, that's 70 years. Hypothetically, if we took 10% of that, that'd be a 7-year-old. Would a 7-year-old be considered to be a child? Do you follow where I'm going with this? We would say a 7-year-old is definitely a child. If Isaiah said that the child shall be 100 years old, and I know we're kind of stretching this out a little bit here, but theoretically, if that same ratio was maintained, a child of 100 means an adult could be 1,000. Could have lived the entire 1,000 years. We know Methuselah lived 969 years in his lifespan. We know many of the people. Do you know this is totally has zero to do with this lesson, which has never stopped me before. But do you know that the population of this planet pre-flood, prior to the flood, was probably about 3 to 5 times what it is right now? Consider this. Women lived 400, 500, 600 years, 700 years. Bore children for 700 years. Is that not right? So we projected the population of the world prior to the flood was 3 to 5 times what the population before that. That's what 40 billion people on the earth at that point in time. I mean, ladies, you could have had 35, 40 children. So, at any rate, whenever this thing begins to wind down, the 1,000 years comes to its close, Satan is loose from his pit. He's going to be able to gather together all of those unbelievers who went into the millennium in their earthly bodies, create a rebellion against Christ, convince them that they can defeat him, and they move from all around the world. They move toward Jerusalem to destroy him. And when they get close enough to Jerusalem for them to launch their attack, God the Father simply rains down fire out of heaven and consumes them all. That battle lasts 35, 40 seconds. And it's over with. So that's the millennium. The 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Some things we probably didn't get around to covering, but we have a limited amount of time. Next week we will come back and pick up the Great White Throne Judgment, what all is involved in that, what that judgment consists of, why there are degrees of punishment in hell, and all of those questions. And then we will wrap up with study of heaven. Anybody got any quick questions tonight? All right, if not, thanks for coming.